Okay, today we're going to learn about something called the Pythagorean Theorem, which you may have heard about before. And the Pythagorean Theorem deals with right triangles only. So we're talking about a right triangle, so I'm going to draw one over here. And let's just be clear about the sides of a right triangle. If I call this side A, and this side B, and this side C, the right triangle, the sides of the right angle are actually called the legs of the triangle. So these two sides, A and B, are called the legs. And side C, which is the side that's opposite the right angle, has a special name. It's called a hypotenuse. Hypotenuse, spelled like this. So the Pythagorean theorem says that if a triangle is a right triangle, then the sum of the squares of the legs of the right triangle equals the square of the hypotenuse. So what does that mean? If we look at the triangle from above, what we're saying is since that's a right triangle, and A and B are legs, and C is the hypotenuse, then A squared plus B squared has to equal C squared. That's what I mean by the sum of the squares of the legs equals the square of the hypotenuse. And you can use the Pythagorean theorem to find the lengths of missing sides of any right triangle. For instance, if you're given two sides and you want to find the third side, you plug in the two sides into this formula and you solve for the missing side. Let's try an example. I'm going to write the Pythagorean theorem up at the top. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Remember that these two must be the legs, and the legs again are the sides of the right angle, and this must be the hypotenuse. And again, we're only talking about right triangles. This only works for right triangles. Right triangle. Okay, just as a reminder. So let's try a problem. Let's say I give you this triangle. It's a right triangle. I give you this side, but I don't give you this side. And I ask you to find n. So in the textbook, when they're asking you to do these homework problems, they might say, solve the right triangle. And what they're asking you to do is find the missing sides. So in this case, we have to figure out which are sides A and B and which is side C. C is always the hypotenuse, which is always opposite the right angle. And a little hint, it's always the largest side. So 13 is actually C. So we can fill in the formula, 5 squared plus n squared equals 13 squared. And if we actually square these, we get 25 plus n squared equals 169. Now it's just an equation that we can solve just like any other equation. Subtract 25. You get n squared equals 144. And then again, to undo the square, you're going to square root both sides. This is why we've learned about square roots. And now we've got n equals 12. Now, in previous sections, when we took the square root of both sides, we found the positive and negative square root of 144. But it doesn't make sense in this case to write 12 or negative 12 because you can't have the side of a triangle equaling a negative number. Okay, again, if I ask you to solve this right triangle, the first thing you have to do is figure out which are the legs and which is the hypotenuse. Hopefully you figured out that you always know that the hypotenuse is opposite the right angle. So we're going to have 8 squared plus x squared equals 11 squared. And then calculating this, you get 64 plus x squared equals 121. Then you're going to subtract 64 from both sides, showing all your steps. You get x squared equals 57. Now 57 is not a perfect square. So on the test, I'm not going to allow you to use a calculator, so what I would accept is if you do this. If I ask you to, let's say, write an exact answer, what I'm asking you to do is this. The square root undoes the square, so we have x on the left, and I write it as the square root of 57. And that would be my final answer. And I'm okay if you leave it like that. If, however, I asked for an estimate, you could say it's between 7 and 8, and the reason you know that, you could say it's between 7 and 8 because 7 squared is 49, and 8 squared is 64, and 57 is between 49 and 64. Okay, let's try a word problem. This one says, a building is 10 feet tall. A ladder leans against it so that the base is 3 feet from the building. How long is the ladder? and you can round to the nearest tenth. You can use a calculator. So if you were to draw this picture, I would definitely suggest drawing it. Let's say we'll just call that the building. And it said that the building was 10 feet tall, so I'm going to label that 10 feet. And it says that the ladder is leaning against it so that the base is 3 feet from the building. So let's say it's leaning against the building like this. Here's my ladder. I'm going to try to draw a little ladder here. And this distance, I know it doesn't look necessarily in scale, but we're going to call that 3 feet. Now the question asks you to find how long the ladder is. So you're really looking for the length of this ladder. And we're going to assume that this building is perpendicular to the ground, so it's actually a right triangle. So what you really have is a triangle, like this. Right triangle, where the two legs are 10 and 3. Well, we can write feet, right? 10 feet, 3 feet. And this will be n feet. So we're going to use the Pythagorean Theorem here. We're going to say 10 squared plus, 10 squared, let's make that look good. 10 squared plus 3 squared equals n squared. So we have 100 plus 9 equals n squared. So we have n squared equals 109. And then when we want to solve that, we're going to square root both sides to undo the square over here on the right. So we have n equals the square root of 109. Now since I said you could use a calculator for this problem and you want to round to the nearest tenth, we're going to say that n is approximately 10.4 feet. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something called the converse of the Pythagorean theorem, which is sort of like the reverse of the Pythagorean theorem. It says if in a triangle with sides a, b, and c, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then the triangle is a right triangle. So in this case, you don't know it's a right triangle to start with. You are trying to determine whether it is a right triangle. So I might ask you, if I give you 3 sides of a triangle, you have to determine whether it's a right triangle. Okay, so let's try one. Determine whether these 3 sides would make a right triangle. So if I give you 5 meters, 7 meters, and 12 meters. Okay, so first of all, you always need to pick the largest side to be the hypotenuse. The largest side will always be the hypotenuse, or C. Okay, so when you're filling it into the formula, you're saying is 5 squared plus 7 squared equal to 12 squared. So if you go ahead and calculate this, you'll get is 25 49. Does that equal 144? So then you add these two together and you get 74. That does not equal 144. So the answer is no. It's not a right triangle. Because in order for it to be a right triangle, the left side has to equal the right side. Let's try this one. Here are 3 sides of a triangle, 24 inches, 25 inches, and 7 inches. It's a little bit tricky because in this one I did not put them in order from smallest to largest. So you have to pick the largest. That one has to represent the hypotenuse if it is the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So this is the largest. That would have to be C. You always have to set C being the largest, otherwise the equation will never work. So we're going to have 7 squared plus 24 squared. Does that equal, or is this equal to 25 squared? So 7 squared is 49. 24 squared, if you don't know, you can just do the multiplication. And when you actually multiply them, you should get 576. So 49 plus 576, does that equal, and again, if you don't know what 25 squared is, you would just multiply it off to the side. This is part of showing your work, and you would get 625. I know I took a little shortcut there, but you do get 625. When you add these two guys up, you do get 625. 625 equals 625, so that means yes, these make a right triangle. It is a right triangle. And the way that that right triangle might look would be something like this. This is 7 inches, this is 24 inches, and this is 25 inches.